Such a gentleman. Thank you, Dan. And you're such a dad, Victor. I'm working on, I don't know, Heather, if there's a right way. I think that's probably going to always be a work in progress, because depending on who's involved, that's going to look differently, what's right and what isn't right. But I'm working with a group of Indigenous grandmothers who believe that one of the insulating factors around gender-based violence, and in Nova Scotia, we have the highest rates of human trafficking and the highest rates of Indigenous women and girls being human trafficked in Canada. And so their belief is that it's the wisdom of the grandmothers and the elders woven in to the teachings and the services of organizations working against, to prevent and gender-based violence, that's going to make the difference. And so how we're using data in that example is that, to Victor's point, that we only count who counts. We haven't counted who's serving Indigenous women and girls very well in Nova Scotia. We haven't counted gender-based violence services very well, or women's-based services very well, because we count what counts and we don't count what doesn't. So our starting point is gathering who's providing gender-based violence services, and then asking the grandmothers and the elders. They'll take that data and decide amongst all those services, where would Indigenous women and girls go to seek service? I can't answer that question. Where I go might be different. They're going to use that data then to be able to communicate with all of those organizations, to ask them what needs to change, what needs to happen, and to be able to engage with them and work together to weave the teachings of the elders and the grandmothers into what they're doing. And so the numbers, the data, is a very, minimal starting point to getting to the end goal. So I think it looks differently, Heather, in every way, but for me, that's an example of taking numbers, adding meaning in, I hope, the right way to those numbers. This is, a journey and a learning experience for me, walking this path with these amazing grandmothers, and then hopefully seeing it put to use in the way that the grandmothers and the women, Indigenous women and girls, believe it's going to be the most impactful and effective. And how we measure the success of that will not be just in numbers. It will be the stories and the face-to-face interactions and the experience of these women, because that's what it's about. It's about changing the experience of Indigenous women and girls, not changing the numbers on the tally sheet.
I think there's a really important conversation around who owns that data, and I'm not sure that I'm not really sure that I've fully gathered or wrapped my head around the idea of ownership of data. But then that's because I have a challenge around ownership, period, of many things. But I do think it's critically important to ensure that the data is accessible and contributable. Like, we have the ability to contribute and sort of address where we see inaccuracy in data that is being used. And I think it's incredibly important that we have the ability to access data that is out there, even when that data is unflattering against the very institutions that have collected it. And so I think it's really important for us to, as a start point, my mind goes to the mutability of data and the ability to access it. Ownership is a really critical conversation as well. And I think it would be unfair for us to simply gloss over that point, because I think Louise's caution of us around who owns that information is really critical. The other piece that I think is essential is what Narinda talked about. Race-based data it's essential, but what we're really talking about isn't race-based data. We're talking about differentiated experience, right? Data that captures how folks, constituencies, demographics, people are experiencing a common stimulus, whether it's the economy, education, healthcare, etc. And I think that's critical. And funding that collection of information, right, is I think something that is wholly under resourced. So one of the things that I'll name, and I think is critically important for us, is we should be able to own the data collection process by ensuring that we're able to readily and responsibly collect data that matters to us, and I'm talking about Black communities. And so I think that's a requirement of that, is ensuring that the capacity, both from a capital, including a capital perspective, is available, and that's something that I think has been probably one of the more alarming realizations for me. As much as I talked about the unfunded report being a $5,000 report, it was only that because we were able to rely on the significant resources of a university partner who gave us lots and lots of graduate students to work with. That isn't the case for so many of our organizations, right? So I think it's really, really important to ensure that the resources to conduct studies, to collect data, then to transmit and mobilize that knowledge that's once it's been gained is available. Because the unfunded report would have had zero impact if we didn't already have an audience that we could access and could hear us. If there wasn't an ability to know where that information already exists. And then if we didn't have access to a publicly funded university that provided us tremendous graduate student support to look at that data, collect that data, and then to put it in a way that was useful. So again, like I was $5,000 in sort of cash, but in real time, it took a number of existing institutions and resources to put that together. So that's another thing that I would share.
Yeah, so just to segue off Liban's points, and I thank you for your brilliance, brother. I agree in terms of the ownership piece, because I'm a firm believer in the quotes, power attracts the worst, and power usually corrupts the best. So definitely the ownership piece is troublesome, but stewardship is more important. But to be able to steward, you have to at some point take the reins. So I believe in data stewardship. And if we can get to a place where we are in a position to steward the data, we're in a much better place. And when I think of the very first board of directors I sat on, I was 18. And we used to go to Dr. Chris Morgan's house, so the Black Health Alliance. This is before BHA was big. And we were using data from the Ramanoff reports. And this report came out, so this is a lot. I'm 39 years old right now. This is 20 years ago, or 21 years ago. And this report spoke to health disparities, as Narinder mentioned, the healthcare system, and how the healthcare system was literally not engaged in Black communities at all. That report was leveraged by Dr. Chris Morgan and his colleagues, Floydine Charles, a lot of elders in the Black community are on the board of the Black Health Alliance, Farley Flex, to build Taibu, the first Black community health center that's still around in Malvern to this day. And then when I think about where my wife, the work that she used to participate in at Women's Health and Women's Hands, or the incredible work of the Canadian Women's Foundation and Paulette Senior and Segal, if there isn't data ownership by women, then they would not have been able to steward these remarkable organizations and build out these institutions. So I agree with you completely that there is a challenge around ownership because, once again, power attracts the worst and corrupts the best. But in the same spirit, if we can create accountability mechanisms, governance models and frameworks around what ownership and subsequent stewardship can look like in terms of an equitable data model and framework, I think we're off to the races. But once again, this is a generational struggle that our ancestors have been at for centuries. So once again, I thank you for your leadership and brilliance, brother.
I just want to add in really quickly to the brilliance of this conversation, a +1 to you said, Victor. All of these comments are reminding me of the power of having partnership infrastructure in place, relationships really based in trust, and the collaborative governance structures where those who are most impacted by the systems that need to change are at the tables that they've helped to set, as we've talked about before, with those who currently hold the structural power to make the changes.
Okay, we have Robin. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I have to start by applauding the brilliance, and my mind is just overwhelmed by not only the brilliance that's being shared here, but the actions that are being taken in communities. Yeah, so I'm thinking about a journey that I've heard the panelists describe, but I'm wondering if you could give a bit more depth on this journey between data that is presented to us and how does it become shareable, and then how does it direct to change in actions or change in experience? So I think there's a bit of a pathway there that I'm wondering what your experience is as those that have sort of, you've done that pathway in some cases, like Liban's experience of the unfunded report. What does that look like, and what needs to be done to make that happen more often? The data that we have on hand is static until it is made real, until somebody does something about it. And panelists, you've all explained a little bit about experiences or let's say examples of where that has happened. The value of that data when it tells, because data always tells a story, when it tells a story, the story becomes more powerful when it is realized, it's shared, and then it changes experience or it changes actions of others. So you told a couple of examples, but they vary between, like having the Indigenous grandmothers analyze it and make that an experience in the story, versus your example, Liban, where it took effectively a university to, I'm not saying it took a university, but there were conditions under which that report was able to advance. So what do we need to see more of in order to make the data that is there and available to us be more action oriented and be realized by the people that are experiencing it? Is that any better in terms of description of my question? I'm not sure it is, but if anybody feels like they can weigh in, I'd be happy.
Liban, did you want to start or no? Okay. I'll share a story. So I'm in Ottawa for a few reasons. One of the reasons is at the Family Foundation, we're going to be working to invest in trans communities across Canada. So one of the most underfunded at-risk communities across the country. And so I've been having these conversations, and we have a number of trans leaders from across the world who are here, who happen to be here for a different conference this week. And I was talking to these the leaders of an organization, of a trans organization in Peru, and they were sharing how a lot of the capital in Peru for LGBTQ2+ communities goes to the G. Community, but in all of the annual reports, all the proposals, you have trans faces everywhere. And when I think about the power of data, and I think about the disconnect we see now, the narrative we say and how we're going to do things versus the actual of what we're doing is a big delta. And I think once you get more data, you start to create accountability that gap can no longer exist. And you see this in Canada too. A year ago, I was at a bunch of senior folks. Everyone shared their story on the one highlight of the year. Every story was about either a Black community investment or an Indigenous community investment. And so then when it came to me, I said, okay, so how much of your portion of your portfolio is invested in that community you've shared the story for? Because it's great that you have that story, an awesome story, great, invest, do more. But I want to know what that looks like across your portfolio, because that data is going to tell me more than that one story in the situation of if the values of the foundation in these situations is really driving the way capital is flowing and how support is given. So what I think the power of data, and I don't know, Robin, if I'm getting to your question here, but it's going to close that gap. It's going to close the gap between what we say and what we do. And I think that gives me a lot of hope if we can get this right.
Donovan, I see your hand. So do you want to comment on this? Can I give a shout out to the Toronto Foundation? How many of you have seen that incredible report that came out, I think, is it 2 days ago, on social capital? So one of the brilliant folks behind that is a brother named Mohammed Haq, who so many of you on this call may know. Lots of folks were behind it. But I had like a very brief conversation to congratulate him. I was like, hey, look, I'm in the middle of this like crazy thing. I haven't even read your report. I just saw the title in the front of it. It looks really good. Shout out to your graphics person. But I promise you I will read it in the future. And he said, Liban, that's just like 1/100th of all the information we collected. There's these massive data pools that are available that we never found a way to weave into this work that everyone can use. And he said that Toronto Foundation is committed to making that open sourced. The reason I share that is because it means we don't have to do the study again, right? We don't have to recreate what has already been done, right? How cool is that? Because the truth is, many of us are just recreating, in some ways, a variation of the same study, which is important. But unbeknownst to us is that that work has already been done. And instead of taking 6 months and whatever resources, we can simply utilize what's already there, which is, I think, to Louise's point, who owns the data? Because if a data is owned by particular folks, then that means it's not accessible to everyone or to a select group. And therefore, we're trying to prove a point or get to a conclusion that someone's already arrived at but hasn't shared. So so I understand and appreciate the significance of data ownership. I just want to beat that drum one more time. And to your point, Narinder, the sharing of that information is so critical, because one of the things that Mohammed shared with me, and he spent so much time trying to think about how to make this report legible, not through words, but through like just making sure that everyone can comprehend it. It's not simply for a strata of readers, right? But making sure that it's readable to everyone, and more importantly, then shareable. And that's really difficult. And like, for those of you who've read the unfunded report, you probably have one figure in your head: 7 cents out of every $100, right? But that's not the way that figure was. The figure was like 0.0007 out of like 35 billion. And then we have to find some way to make it readable. So that's also an issue of like, there has to be, and I sorry, apologies to the researchers, there has to be someone that could take these objective numbers and make them readable. Like, it's narrative. And these reports suck sometimes at the narrative piece of it. So I think that there's value in making sure that they're more readable. And honestly, that comes by including those who this research matters to. If you're putting a research report about the experience of Indigenous women, have someone who has that experience telling you, hey, like, here's how you translate that information, because knowledge also needs to be translated. In its raw form, it can be very useless sometimes.
Thank you, Liban. You have Donovan?
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant comments from everyone. Liban touched on sort of the comments I wanted to make in twofold. I recognize this table as sort of the data elite, and I say that not to be offensive to anyone, but there is an issue when we continue to have these conversations at this level, but the data creators that we're talking about are at the grassroots or frontline level, and there's a disconnect between where we are and how we talk about this data and to the folks who are data creators. And there isn't a mechanism or a conversation around how do we build a capacity at the data creator level. Many of them are grassroots, not-for-profit organizations, to be able to feed into or even understand what is data. And so this is a really great conversation, but again, it feels like an academic conversation that isn't grounded in real. How do we actually move the needle? So I just want to pose that there. And I put a question in the chat much earlier. I've switched devices. It's gone. But what is data, right? Because I think at these tables, we look at data as this digestible piece of information. And at the grassroots level, there is so much data that exists within agencies that isn't being used in a meaningful way because people don't actually understand the value of it. And then how do we recognize data? So, I think I'd asked a question before, is data telling a story or validating a story. And oftentimes it's just validating what researchers already wanted to go out and prove. Whereas at the frontline grassroots level, it really is about telling a story. Shameful. I have a master's degree, but in order to get that master's degree, I had to ground everything that I looked at through somebody else's lens. And so that continues to be the struggle when we talk about data. It's how do we validate those who are actual data masters, the folks who are living it, experiencing it on the front line. So I want to pose that question into this conversation to maybe practically move us further along a tangible outcome. Yeah, thank you.
We appreciate that.
If I
Go
could
ahead,
touch on that real quick, because when we talk about data,
I apologize, my friend.
Yeah.
Arlene had her hand up, so could we let Arlene
Okay.
first? Thank you so much.
Yes, sure.
I just wanted to respond to Robin about, and knowing where you're sitting, Robin, about, what we can do. I think others have said this, but sharing what we have a very capitalist and competitive mindset that I see starting to emerge in the data environment and ecosystem. I think we need to step outside of that thinking and be transparent and authentic in our sharing of information. And governments, provincial and federal, you could remove your fee walls. That would be a really good step in the right direction. Some of these solutions aren't complex. They are very simple and practical. Putting your reports out there without fee. Those are very simple ways to Liban's point about the 1%. The data was always there. The ability to access it is the issue, and the willingness to share it without somehow extracting or benefiting from it or as an organization is one of the barriers. And just because somebody brought it up around the conversation around this being elite, Donovan, I think, I appreciate that point, because often these conversations feel to me like they are the 1% talking about the 1%. And this one doesn't feel like that. When I was doing consultations around the disbursement quota and this whole increase the grants movement, it felt eventually very much like it was a group of academics and elite and data specialists talking about vulnerable populations who were none of those things. And so eventually I started to seek out the voices I wasn't hearing, and the story was completely different around the disbursement quota in those voices. And so, I appreciate that we need to really think about who is talking, who is in the space and making the decisions. And, there's any sort of call to action, I would say, picking up on the teachings from Elder Albert Marshall, who I have the privilege of being able to learn from. It's, applying that sort of two-eyed lens to what we're doing and asking, are we the right people to be doing this work? Is this my story to tell? Who else needs to be interpreting this? Who's benefiting and not benefiting from what we're doing? All of those things, I think, will help us move this into the spaces and to the grassroots level. And it's about who we are and how we're operating, and being very aware and taking the time to reflect and apply that two-eyed seeing lens. Like, what's our worldview and what other worldviews are we not aware of, are we not open to, or listening to, or seeking? It's true. It feels often in these circles like that.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, just to touch on Donovan's comment / question around the data creators versus the data researchers. And I noticed that R&D is very minimal in our community, and that's research and development. We've been research to death and underdeveloped. So now the research that we started doing, we realized that we're a developing community within a developed country. So a lot of the things that are researched usually isn't used to develop us. It's usually used to just highlight people's work and not really used to develop the communities. So this is where, and we talked about this, Victor, at our study groups, where it's an ongoing conversation. And Heather, this question, I don't think it was answered. The conversation 100% will continue, because it has to be identifying people's priorities and then attaching that to the research so that we can develop the priorities. So if a person is the data creator and they have priorities, the people doing the research have to link it back to what that person's life is, how that person's life is being affected, and how we can develop it so that it can be evolved into a thriving community. If we just do the research and it doesn't connect to people's priorities, it's really wasted time. So I just wanted to kind of connect Heather's question to Donovan's and show that we want to use this research to actually develop the communities.
One of the things that I'm most excited about with the Decolonizing Data Institute is the ability to generate new narratives and new stories, because we are profoundly affected by stories and by framing. And one of the stories that we have in our culture is that government is bugging private foundations about how much they have to disperse. They're getting into the business of private entities. And the real story is that private foundations are part of a profound social contract. And the only thing private about them is that public resourcing was moved to them to put under their private authority because they were willing to put in some of their own money. But the tax credits and that public resourcing of that private foundation means that we are in a social contract. And the fact that assets that are held by charities with the purpose of moving their charitable piece forward, that they are not required to use those assets to advance their charitable purpose is bizarre. And it can only exist when there's the current narrative, which is that it's their money, government has to stay out of it. They stop bothering them. And it's like, no. Massive public resources have been put into the creation of the private foundation, and we're glad for it because that private person is putting more money into the pool, but it is a social contract. And illuminating that, and then having the conversation about how much of assets should be put under what disbursements, because it's actually not their money. It is, or at least half of it is not their money. And so that ability to just generate, and I love that this session was grounded in poetry and the spoken word and speaking something into life, because it's not private foundations versus government versus us versus everything. It's like we're all in this together, the human family. And these are the structures that we have created, and it's our resourcing that's being moved around. And how can we do that in a way that generates new narratives, that generate life and more equitable sharing of resources?
Thank you so much, Catherine. And Donovan, I'm gonna lean on you, Elder Big Bro, because of your statements. We actually have a campaign. We have something Black History Month around data is love. So I'm gonna pull you in to ground the conversation at a level that you feel would be more appropriate. And before I hand it off to Sarah, to Gigi and Sarah to close, I just wanted to share two very brief stories to take it down all the way down to the ground. My mother's name is Maureen, but her documentation says Gloria. From a data perspective, in St. Lucia at the time, you could only have a birth certificate if you were Catholic. So her mother and her father had to give her the name Gloria on the piece of paper, even though her name was Maureen. From my perspective, my first interaction with data was when I was 12 years old on Rhoda Boulevard in Kingston, Galloway, when a police officer asked me for my ID and smushed my face. And it was not the best interaction. And I'm still traumatized by that action to this day. Just 2 weeks ago, I turned down a federal opportunity with the federal government to sit at an advisory table because they wanted some data from me that I didn't want to give them. And they said, if you cannot give us this data, you cannot get clearance to be on this advisory. So I stepped away. So I'm saying all to say that I'm not an academic by any means. And we definitely don't want to have the conversation on a 30,000-foot level. We want to bring it down to the people. That's what it's about. For me, the people. So D, I'm going to reach out and we're going to continue to build. And we are over time. But we assume the conversation was going to be robust. So I'm going to hand it off to Gigi and to Sarah. And thank you all for your leadership, your love, your brilliance. Narinder, all the panelists, Alana, Catherine, Arlene, Liban, Brother Ryan, thank you. So appreciate you. And Daniel, my remarkable colleague. I'm gonna hand it off to Gigi and Sarah.